Welcome to DC Insiders, where we bring you sharp views about global issues with relevance to Taiwan from the political capital of the world here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Wenchi Yu. Invisible yet indispensable, undersea cables are the backbone of our digital world, carrying over 95% of international internet and data traffic. As technology, AI, and cloud services drive data needs exponentially higher, these critical lines are becoming central to geopolitical competition and national security. Increasingly, major powers control, construct, and protect subsea cables, raising new questions around vulnerability, espionage, and resilience. Taiwan's high-tech economy is powered by a hidden network of undersea cables. It also connects the island to the global community. Yet, as data flows surge, threats to these lifelines are growing. Taiwan's strategic position makes it a focal point for both regional connectivity and rising geopolitical risks, with undersea cables increasingly targeted by cyber attacks, sabotage, and power competition. Today, we're speaking to Erin Murphy of CSIS to dive into the global strategic significance of undersea cables. We want to explore the latest risks and innovations and examine what governments, private sector, and international parties can do to safeguard the hidden lifelines in the era of mounting threats. From the Indo Pacific to the Atlantic, we will discuss the emerging policy priorities, critical lessons from recent incidents, and the urgent need for cooperation to secure the world's information highways. Welcome, Erin. Good to have you.
Thank you, Wenchi. Thanks for having me.
So why are undersea cables so important to the world right now, and especially for Taiwan?
So subsea cables are the backbone of the internet. It is how we do almost everything that is online. It's internet connectivity, it's emails, it's financial transactions, it's all of our communications. So nearly every aspect of our daily lives touches a subsea cable in some way. Now, in particular for Taiwan, it's an island country. You can have terrestrial connectivity with fiber optics over land, but you really need to connect into the global system. And so for Taiwan, these subsea cables connect it to the rest of the world.
Is there any other way for Taiwan to connect to the world other than subsea cables? And how many are there?
So we have about 1.5 million kilometers of subsea cables that circumnavigate the globe. And what makes this infrastructure so important is the amount of data that it can push through per second. So in a fiber optic cable, you can push through terabits of information per second. And in fact, the newer cables are able to push through petabits of information per second. Now, there's satellite connectivity that can help countries get online, make sure that you can send emails, send attachments in emails, do financial transactions, but you're really only doing gigabytes per second.
So the speed and the volume, yeah.
Correct. And it's also much more affordable to have a subsea cable. I mean, satellites certainly have a role to play, especially with rural connectivity and being a backup system, but primarily where you're going to get that internet connectivity is through subsea cables.
There's been some worry about potentially should there been, any invasion or attack from China or any other disasters or any emergencies that Taiwan may lose its connectivity to the world. And so there's some conversation about satellites. Can that replace subsea cables?
It cannot. It can provide correct. It can provide a decent alternative, but if, say, multiple subsea cables go out, whether it's an accident, a natural disaster, which has happened in Taiwan before, or because of intentional sabotage, you're going to have to make a decision as to who can use that connectivity and when. So what operations are most important that's going to need to use that? And also when you have Taiwan, which is a highly developed country that's really making advancements in AI and quantum computing, you need those subsea cables to be able to do the amount of data that you're going to use.
So internet and transactions make a lot of sense. But how has the advanced technology, and we're talking about today, like AI, 5G, and other much more advanced technologies, how has that changed, again, Taiwan's access or connectivity through the subsea cables? Is the demand growing exponentially?
So overall, I would say since the COVID-19 pandemic, the need for accessibility has increased exponentially. And that's not just for developed countries, that's going to developing countries as well.
Why is the pandemic relevant?
Because everything moved online, and we were able to see how you could do economic growth and have accessibility online when we were all told to stay home to make sure that we didn't infect other people. You had to move education online. A lot of the businesses that were able to survive did so because they were doing e-commerce or able to do those financial transactions online. Telehealth, that's an increasing accessibility issue for people, especially in rural communities that don't have access to healthcare. And so that's important in places like the United States, also in places like Taiwan, and also in places with a lot of rural areas or elderly population that just can't go to doctors when they want to. But you have a youth population that's growing as well, especially in Africa, and they are more attuned to digital connectivity, are more apt to use internet-based programs and applications.
So it sounds like the world is much more dependent on the internet itself, and therefore subsea cables that transmit all the data. Now, in the case of, let's put it back in the context of Taiwan, especially U.S. China competition and geopolitics, what are the implications, just given that Taiwan needs connectivity and geopolitics seems to play a role?
Right, and geopolitical tensions are making this infrastructure that much more part of the consciousness and government policymaking because it is vulnerable. And that's especially true for Taiwan in that it's an island nation, but it's also incredibly close to China, and that China's territorial waters, their claims can overlap with Taiwan. So they can prevent permitting for repairing and laying of new cables. So one of the ways that you can build in resiliency into the network is by having redundancy. So laying more cables. So if there is an accident, if there is a natural disaster, cable operators can reroute traffic through other cables and through other fiber optic pairs so that you don't really lose that connectivity. But for Taiwan, it only has so many options as to where it can go.
But who actually operate those cables? Is it the government? Is it now primarily the private sector? Help us understand.
So this is what is really interesting about the subsea cable network, because there are a lot of national and economic security implications, but this network is almost predominantly owned and operated by the private sectors.
Who are the owners?
Right. So in the 90s and the early 2000s, you had a sort of a consortium model where you had subsea cable manufacturers. There's only really 4 in the world: Subcom in the United States, NAC in Japan, HMN Tech in China, and ASN in France. But you also have telecoms that are generally involved in these consortia and also help finance and support the building of cables. For some countries, that's government owned, but for the most part, it's actually privately owned. But what's really changed the landscape are the so-called hyperscalers that are owning and operating these subsea cables. So that's Google, that's Amazon Web Services,
the big tech companies,
Microsoft, Meta.
Yeah.
And so they're the ones that are laying some of the biggest and the fastest cables that we see today.
So they're the ones who are actually laying the subsea cables.
They contract out to lay the cables, but they're the ones that are owning and operating. So if something happens to a cable, they contract out to a cable repair company that's then able to go and fix what's happening. But they work with service providers, they work with manufacturers, those big 4 that I mentioned, and work with others in a consortia to be able to finance it, or they finance it themselves.
Well, but since they're actually undersea, and so it becomes interesting in terms of the territory issues,
yes.
Right? So let's say the cables under the Pacific are damaged, and if there are disputes, because nobody knows who the, sabotage actors are, how does that get resolved?
So there's international frameworks and then there's local laws. And in some ways it can be very confusing, and in some ways it's not enforced well enough to help protect the cable. So there's a couple of international frameworks. There's an 1884 convention.
1884?
Yeah, subsea cables is one of our...
Then there are the subsea cables.
Yeah. Subsea cables is one of our oldest telecommunications infrastructure, but also one of our most important. And this 1884 convention really governed the telegraph links that connected. In fact, the first transatlantic cable was laid in 1858 that connected the United States to Europe. But the 1884 convention tried to put protections in terms of if something is damaged in the case of conflict, who has a territorial rights to repair. Now, in international waters, it's just you're doing what you do. But there's also UNCLOS, the UN Commission on the Law of the Sea. But UNCLOS, governs all the laws of the seas. It helps determine where the territorial claims are, the continental shelves, exclusive economic zones where countries can say, these are my territories, so if something happens here, we're in charge. So when it comes to territories, that's where things get a little overlapping. So for the United States, there's about a dozen federal agencies that oversee subsea cables, from FCC to the Department of Homeland Security, but also state, local, tribal, that have their own laws about permitting and licensing. So, when damage happens, the subsea cable owner and operator knows what happens. They go out and try to fix it as soon as possible. Sometimes they need a permit depending on where it happens. Sometimes they don't. And there's a lot that you have to deal with, from storms possibly, or the permitting issue, or what's called cabotage laws, which a country has. The U.S. has the Jones Act, which has certain protectionist requirements for ships. They either have to be that country flagged or have crew that is from that country, and that's not always available.
Yeah. We want to talk a little bit about China's Digital Silk Road initiative, and also its impact just on the global cable projects, especially in emerging markets, because they've been helping developing countries. So share more with our audience.
So China is one of the big four manufacturers with HMN Tech.
What is that? Is that a cable?
They don't have a huge percentage of the cable manufacturing, and that's been an effort, a diplomatic effort, to try to keep China out among U.S. partners and allies to ensure that trusted technology is going under the sea. They're part of a multitude of subsea cable projects in the Pacific, and so they're also part of consortia. So Chinese telcos like China Mobile, China Telecom are part of these consortia that help finance and support the laying of these cables. So you'll see them in Southeast Asia for the Pacific Islands, and generally where it is, but they're all over the world. And it's not even so much whether they build the cable or own and operate it, it's also that they have a big role in repairing the cable. China is the world's largest ship maker, and so they're able to deploy cable ships to repair. And I think that gets people nervous about, could they tamper with the cable? What are they exactly doing?
So they don't just repair their own cables, but they also repair other cables.
Yeah. So for example, NEC, which is a Japanese telecom company, or they manufacture cables, they don't have their own cable ships. So they have to rely on available ships to either lay the cable or repair the cable. And in some cases, that might be a Chinese ship.
So are you saying those who manufacture cables are not necessarily the companies that repair cables?
Some companies can do both. It's a very expensive business because you have to have a ship, you have to have technicians, engineers, and you have to have a ship that's big enough to be able to hold...
technology, right?
Technology. So it's sometimes if there's about 200 cable breaks a year worldwide. And so, it really kind of depends on, where the break is happening and what ship that you can call up. Sometimes they end up being very expensive floating warehouses.
And how are cables damaged usually?
It's mostly because of accidents, and it's in waterways that have a lot of commercial and fishing vessels. They can drop an anchor not knowing that a cable is there, and the anchor can drag across the cable and damage it. Same thing with fishing vessels. Now, the subsea cable infrastructure is open source, so anyone can access, and they should know where it is, but accidents do happen. The next, likelihood of cable damage is from natural disasters. So in 2011, the Tohoku earthquake in Japan severed multiple cables, and both from the earthquake, but also the tsunami, and then the radioactivity from the Fukushima nuclear plant prevented cable ships from going in. So you really had multiple crises there. And also the Tonga volcano in 2022 just eviscerated multiple cables.
And what about state actors behind the sabotage. Has that happened?
Probably. And I say probably because it's really difficult to determine whether or not a cable has been intentionally cut. Now, there's been a lot of suspicion, and I think with rising geopolitical tensions, these cable cuts are going to be, I think, at first considered this is sabotage.
Why do you say it's been hard to actually pinpoint whether state actors are behind it?
So subsea cables are everywhere, and so is commercial and fishing traffic. And so the way that you're able to kind of tell that maybe something suspicious is happening is if a ship kind of goes back and forth, because if you drop an anchor and drag it across the ocean, it doesn't necessarily hit the cable right away. It can bounce on the ocean floor, skip the cable, and you don't damage it. But if you're kind of going like this, you have a greater likelihood of being able to damage that cable. So this is called gray zone tactics. It's potential acts of sabotage that go just right under the threshold of war. And that's kind of gray enough that you're not sure if it's intentional or if it's like, whoops, it's an accident.
What are some of the incidents?
So in Taiwan, there's been two incidents that I think have really drawn public attention in 2023. The Matsu Islands were cut off. Taiwan suspected Chinese vessels of intentionally cutting cables. Of course, China denied this. And in 2025, just this year, Taiwan charged for the first time a ship captain for intentionally damaging cables. Of course, they denied it. But
these are Chinese vessels?
Chinese vessels. Now, in the Baltic Sea, there have been multiple cuts. A Chinese ship was involved, but mostly from Russian activity. They have these ghost fleets or these shadow fleets, these oil tankers that are trying to avoid the sanctions that have been placed on them. And, they're kind of going back and forth. And so there's a lot of questions as, was this an accident?
Yeah.
And with the geopolitical tensions these days, you do want to be careful before you start pointing fingers and unintentionally trigger something worse.
Yeah. As you said, these are gray zone tactics that can be easily deployed, and therefore it's harder for governments to put in prevention measures. So what are some of the things that can be done?
So one is building redundancy, making sure that you have plenty of cables so that you are at least dealing with the connectivity issues. So if one cable is cut, you can reroute the traffic. The other is that, you really have to have private sector and public sector connectivity here. For the private sector, their biggest concern is permitting. It takes them forever to lay cables. It's faster than ever to manufacture these cables, but to get the permitting, it's now taking longer than ever to lay them.
And the permitting will require different governments,
Correct.
I assume.
But for governments, their biggest concern are acts of sabotage or, some sort of catastrophic event. It's low probability but high risk, whereas for the private sector, it's all high probability and equal risk. So for them to kind of come together to discuss how can government be helpful in allowing this network to be redundant. So I think there's a shared acceptance that this is one of the areas that you can do that. There's also the government role in potentially monitoring areas of high risk where they think that these incidents would happen. So NATO has started something called Baltic Sentry, where you use multiple naval assets to monitor where ships are going, especially suspicious ships, to try to prevent or deter attacks.
And that's based on the national flags they're flying? What are they monitoring?
That's a good question. So any ship can buy a flag from some country.
I
mean, it's a business. Yeah. So Togo, Liberia, multiple Caribbean islands. And so the other thing is to ensure that there's steep fines, penalties, potential jail time that also targets the countries that are flagged on these ships. So I'm sure Liberia does not want to be dragged into gray zone tactics. They're just trying to, help their economy and use whatever they can to support the shipping industry. But I'm sure that, Belize also doesn't want to be paying gazillions of dollars in fines, but you have to make it punitive. For example, U.S. fines are pretty limited. I don't recall what the actual fine number is, but it's something I could pay, which is saying a lot.
Yeah. And it's probably less directly relevant to America, right? Because America is mostly a land kind of country. Is it much connected to the rest of the world?
Oh, very much so. In fact, we have the most amount of cable landing stations and cables coming in and out of the United States. It connects us to Europe. It connects us to Africa. It even connects us through the Pacific. So a lot of
within the country itself, it doesn't really rely so much on the cables, or does it also rely on?
It also relies on the cables. So the communications, the financial transactions that come in from overseas, it helps connect our island nations like Hawaii and Guam. But it also helps us power connectivity to and from these countries. So if one of those cables cut, we feel that here too. So our banking transactions are much slower. We can't send emails like we could. We can't use WhatsApp like we can.
Yeah. Now, I kind of asked, but just curious if there is some kind of international effort right now that is more current to address or prevent the future, disruption of subsea cables.
So you're seeing it in international organizations like NATO. The EU has made this a national security priority. The G7 has called this a national security priority as well. So kind of discussing ways that countries can come together, whether it's trying to retrofit naval ships for surge capacity to help repair cables, but also how do you protect repair ships or cable laying ships in areas of conflict? So the Red Sea, there's been a lot of issues with pirates from Djibouti, but there's also been problems with the Houthi rebels that have also incidentally and not directly caused cables to be cut. They shot a missile, hit a ship, that ship dropped anchor, and then dragged over cables. So, the Houthis didn't mean to, but they did. And then, how do you get a ship to go in and repair that when there's active conflict? It's highly dangerous. So the UN, UNCLOS, they are trying to update, the framework, but not every country has ratified. And it's not even just ratifying it, it's enforcing what the elements are of that. There are international organizations that provide best practices and capacity building, like the ICPC, the International Cable Protection Committee, that has private sector actors and governments that are part of it. So it is a real topic of conversation. So it's you're very timely with this discussion.
Yeah. Are there any blind spots in terms of just understanding of those issues? Has this gotten much attention in the U.S. government? I know in Taiwan, of course, because it's so relevant. But what about the U.S. and other countries?
There's growing interest in Washington because I think, in understanding just the competition side, where China is in there. And of course, the U.S. is always concerned about competing with China. But also in terms of our own connectivity and making sure that our subsea cables and those of our partners and allies are safe. So Congress has been talking about introducing pieces of legislation that address subsea cables. This administration, they've mentioned it in bilats with the Indians and with other countries as well. So it is top of mind. When you talk about blind spots, but I think this is really where that communication between public and private sector is so important. This is predominantly a private sector-led infrastructure. They're laying cables where the demand is, where it's commercially viable. That doesn't necessarily always line up with national security and foreign policy priorities.
And have they been communicating with the government? How are their interests kind of different from the government's?
It gets back to private sector worrying about permitting, just the day-to-day of being able to lay a cable. And then for government, really thinking of these more catastrophic issues that are incredibly low profile. I think it's a lot of talking past each other at this point where, government expects this, doesn't necessarily think in a profit-making enterprise, which for subsea cable, it's very exciting industry, but it's also extremely expensive. And I actually have an example here.
Yeah, show us. How does it work? Is it really this small or is it much bigger?
So this is what you see that lays right on the bottom of deep ocean because it doesn't need as much armoring and protection because there's really not much that's...
Yeah.
But this is a cable for Subcom, which is one of the largest manufacturers. It's based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But the key part of it is these fiber optics, which are really hardly thicker than a hair. And then it's this polyethylene, this sort of hard plastic that helps prevent water from coming in. So you have to prevent the salt water from coming in, but then you also have to just protect the cable itself from cutting, from ocean floor.
And what are the materials that wrap around it? I assume something very solid.
Yes, yes. So this is galvanized steel, and then around that is a copper tape, and that copper tape helps conducts the connectivity. It pushes the data through. And then you have another layer of polyethylene. Now, if this is in, say, like close to shallow waters where there's like rockier terrain or high vessel traffic, you're going to have another layer of galvanized steel, this special yarn, dip it in tar, and then you do another layer. But generally, it doesn't get any bigger than this. So it's really small.
Yeah, it's really small. And so how would you repair it though? I mean, if it's damaged, it looks really hard if it's just one small part of it, right?
Correct. So once they identify where the damage is, a cable ship goes out and they lift it from the floor, cut, splice like you would, anywhere else. They test to see if it works, and then they drop the cable down, but they have these autonomous vehicles, a plow, something that will guide it down to the bottom of the sea. Before it used to be divers, and depending on where it is, you could use divers. But, the underwater plow can help bury it under sand to further protect it. They test it again to make sure it's working, and that's how you do it.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. It's been a huge learning lesson for me, myself. So thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching DC Insiders. Please follow us on social media to get the latest episode. See you next time.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
For TaiwanPlus.
TaiwanPlus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.